And welcome to this edition of Dr. Carole's Couch. I'm your psychiatrist host, Dr. Carole Lieberman. I cannot wait to get to this and to interview my next guest. This is a fascinating subject. And the name of the show today is Killed to Order, China's Organ Harvesting Plague. So it's not just a rumor that China is harvesting organs. It's really happening. The Chinese Communist Party has been harvesting organs from people they want to be rid of conveniently. It's not just random people, but as you will hear, there are people who they would like to be rid of anyway. And this is what's that? Killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. Um, so they're harvesting organs from these people, which essentially kills them, and gives the organs to the highest bidders. Today's guest is Jan Jekielek, and he is the author of this new book called Killed to Order: China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. So he spent 20 years researching this book, researching this phenomenon, and he is now telling the world about it. It's already become a bestseller. And he is revealing also, as a side note, what America is doing, perhaps inadvertently, to enable this industry in China. And if you think that something like this couldn't happen here, think again. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jan Jekielek. I think I'm going to call you Jan for the rest of the show because I'm having trouble pronouncing your last name. Um, this is amazing. You have done an amazing body of work because, yes, there have been these rumors and uh, people, have know sort of on some level to a greater or lesser degree that China is harvesting organs. I mean, that's what's been said. I remember there was an episode of Law and Order about organ harvesting. I don't know if you saw that, but anyhow, you are you are the person who has been brave enough to actually do the research and report it in a book. It's no wonder it's a bestseller. So, I want to start off by asking you a bit about your background. Yes, I'm a psychiatrist. I have to start with your parents. What did your parents do to get you to become interested in organ harvesting? Seriously, like where were you born and how did you end up doing this?
Well, it does actually start with my parents. I think that's very on point because my parents fled communist Poland in 1970. And I basically arrived in Toronto, Canada, in the womb, so to speak, and came out upon arrival, kind of the definition of fresh off the boat, I suppose. And I learned Polish as a first language, basically, and English from soap operas and Sesame Street. And later in life, I went all over the world doing different things, and ended up in the U.S. where I'm based right now. But my parents sort of taught me about communism and how it was something that they had to literally escape from. And so I've always known that it was a bad system. But frankly, I didn't entirely grasp why. It's taken me the last 20, 25 years to really kind of understand that. And that's actually a key part of what I try to explain in the book, that this kill to order industry that they've built is actually kind of a feature of the system. It's what you would expect to get, not some kind of black market odd aberration. And another kind of really important thing is this is not your garden variety, also horrible organ trafficking that you hear about happening in Mexico or India, or frankly, even in the United States. I've heard a few cases. No, this is something much, much larger scale and much more monstrous because it's a state actor.
Huh. So, were you living in China at some point?
So the closest I've gotten, well, the closest, of course, I was in Hong Kong right before the national security law came in. So if you recall, in 2019, there was a large protest movement in Hong Kong that I was covering. In fact, I interviewed some of the leaders there, including the amazing Cardinal Zen, who's been kind of against this Vatican deal that the Vatican has made with the communist China that's been kind of a disaster for religious believers of all sorts, actually, in China. But so right before they enacted this national security law, and the national security law says, essentially, if I'm having this conversation with you right now, that could give me 10 years in prison in Hong Kong or China. So I try to avoid it at all costs. I got put on a list when it was around 2006, 2005, 2006. I remember we did a visa run to Vietnam, and I knew at that point that I was on a Chinese blacklist. I won't go into the details, but so I've also been at the UN on the NGO side of it and sort of faced off with Chinese diplomats and so forth. So that also puts you on the radar and makes it very hard to go there.
Huh. Um, okay. Well, one of the things that I was thinking in the lead up to interviewing you was clearly this book is making you sort of one of China's number one targets.
Hmm.
Are you worried about your are you worried that you're going to be scooped up for an organ?
So that's a it's an interesting point. I kind of joke, and you'll appreciate this even more as a psychiatrist, that the more people ask me this question, the more worried I get. But
Yeah.
no, in all seriousness, it's an extremely dangerous regime. It does terrible things to people that oppose it. But what's really interesting about it is they have this weird mentality where they truly believe that all Chinese people, all Han Chinese and other minorities of the 55 different minorities that live within China, they kind of own them. They kind of imagine that even if you're not Chinese. So it's actually much more dangerous for people who are Chinese to be doing this kind of thing
Yeah.
than it is for me. And so that's kind of a roundabout way of saying I'm less worried and someone's got to do it. But of course, there's risk.
Okay. I actually have been to China. I was there years ago with my mother, and I'll never forget. We were was on a tour. I mean, it was a like a package tour, and we were there was China, and it was um, some Hong Kong, and there was a few other Thailand. It was a round trip, or going around that area. Um, and what I will never forget, my mother had gotten ill on some of like her stomach was upset from some food, and so she didn't want to leave the room. And I think I went with the tour for some place, or I went out for something. First of all, they had people on the floor. At each end of the floor in the hotel, there were people watching you going in and out and all of that. And I went out, I think I went out to get her some medicine. And it was just very scary, quite frankly. That we were under surveillance, and it was, my mother was sick, and here we are in this country that is, surveilling us. And so it was very uh they probably didn't want her organs though. If she was sick, that was one good thing. But anyway, um so I do have some background, some in terms of being there. But let's get to what made you, I think that was how I started. What made you pick this particular subject?
So I was in the China human rights space for a number of years, starting at around 2000. And I actually went to the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. That was what I mentioned when I kind of met some of these Chinese diplomats. And their strategy always, by the way, was always just to attack the messenger when people talked about human rights violations. They denied it and called you evil, roughly. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing a whole body of different types of very
Yeah.
negative comments. But and so for me, it was kind of, I'd heard about rumors about prisoners being killed for organs and that kind of thing. But it was really, I had to kind of be hit over the head with the evidence. And this is what happened in 2006. And actually, it was a very kind of a strange moment because I was traveling in Poland at the time. I was exploring working with the International Society for Human Rights, a group out of Germany. And I got a phone call that 10,000 people in Israel had signed a petition to expose this forced organ harvesting at Auschwitz. So I was like, oh, okay, let me know more about this. So I started looking at, we had done some reporting, initial reporting. There was a whistleblower, and then there was another whistleblower that almost nearly concurrently came out. And when I saw that, the testimony of a woman named Annie in China, that's a pseudonym, and also the testimony of a transplant surgery professor from Israel who had a patient who got a transplant in 2 weeks in China, kind of against all odds, scheduled.
Huh.
I knew that there was something was real, and I actually helped organize again through a fascinating little quirk of fate. I went to the museum of the museum at Auschwitz, and there was a director of education there, and I said to him, I said, Jan Jekielek. I said, that's how you say my name in Polish, right? And he responded to me saying, "Oh, jakie to pan ma swojskie nazwisko," which meant, wow, what a familiar, warm, cozy last name you have. Because my family name, as it would happen, comes from that region where where the Germans built Auschwitz. And
Huh.
so that helped facilitate getting that press conference set up at the Center of Dialogue and Prayer. And so I ended up doing some of the earliest reporting around this issue as well there.
Okay, but could you explain it a little more? How did you get to know about specific cases?
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. So in one case, right, there was a woman named Annie. She came forth with an allegation, very detailed allegation. Her husband had basically been kind of having nightmares, been impossible to live with. She put her foot down. They were both working at a hospital in China, and he confessed to her that he had removed 2,000 corneas from living people.
oh, wow.
Okay. So this was one of these whistleblowers, and she's still in hiding today. And she also had, there's a lot more to that allegation, but that was the beginnings of it. The second allegation, well, it wasn't exactly an allegation, it was an observation, which is that Jacob Levy, professor of transplant surgery at Tel Aviv University, former head of the Israeli Transplant Association, he basically had this patient who told him, and I'll never forget talking on the phone with him about this, that the patient says, "I'm tired of waiting. I'm going to China, and they're doing it for me in 2 weeks." And Jakob said, "That's completely impossible for a whole lot of reasons, which I can explain. If I can explain how this kill to order works, I can explain why that phenomenon. Maybe it's
Well,
obvious, but
yeah. I mean,
the guy
what did this patient need? What organ did this patient need?
a heart. So this
Oh, wow.
patient went, and the patient went and did it, like just came back 2 weeks later, and it got it in 2 weeks scheduled, came back and said, "Okay, done." And so Jakob knew at that point, well, okay, so I'll spell it out. In an ethical transplantation situation, someone needs to have a catastrophic accident, and an ethics team needs to decide that this person is not coming back, because
Right.
that means that we can explant from that person,
Right.
so to speak. And then the second thing that has to happen is there has to be a match. So our bodies reject things which are foreign, including organs. So the way that we deal with that is we try to approximate the blood type, the tissue type. We use anti-rejection drugs. And that's why, so when you add all that up, that one, there has to be a catastrophic accident, which is rare enough. And then two, they have to match in these different ways. That makes it rare to have the right heart available at any given point. And that's why people wait months or years in an ethical system. But
Uh,
here you can get, the guy got it done literally in 2 weeks. And to kind of go back a little bit, what the researchers figured out, that was the moment that we knew that there was something horrible happening. But this 2 week part was the thing that had to be figured out. And so this is what they did. Back in 1999, there was a group called Falun Gong. There were millions of Falun Gong practitioners in China. It was a very popular spiritual meditation discipline based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. This is what people were living. Okay. It was very unusual in that it was very grassroots. There's no hierarchy in it, there's no collection of funds in it, there's no worship, but there is this strong kind of connection to the divine or God. And people are very serious about it. And at the end of 1999, or in 1999, the dictator at the time, he decided he was going to eradicate it because it was so big, 70 to 100 million people doing it, and it wasn't communist. Now, it didn't have anything against the Communist Party, by the way, just to be clear. He just decided this is something that's a threat to us or a threat to me. There's a lot of theories about why he did it in the first place. But
Yeah.
anyway, and what happened at that moment is it set the stage to get this kill to order industry. So because two
Huh.
things were possible. Okay, one is the Chinese Communist Party for decades has made a practice of creating what are so-called black classes. And a black class is a group that is basically vilified by the propaganda organs of the regime and made kind of untouchable. And so at the beginning, it was the landowners. They wanted to seize the landowners' land, nationalize it, and they had to kind of convince the population that this was somehow okay to
Huh.
do, that these were bad people, that they were beneath them, that they were dangerous. There are all sorts of types of propaganda of this nature. Actually, a lot of stuff that you would hear in 1930s Germany, quite frankly, quite similar types of language. And so the Chinese Communist Party has done this to many different groups across history. And the purpose of it is not necessarily to kill everybody who's the landowner or someone, it's to get them to confess to their sins of land ownership or being a pro-democracy student in 89. That was the black class in 89 when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. Or in 1999, being a Falun Gong practitioner. So they wanted to re-educate them, to transform them. This is a horrible thing because it's basically like a kind of forced brainwashing that gets you to break you. And but the Falun Gong proved unusually resilient to this, unusually resilient. So they incarcerated a massive group of people. And that's the second condition that sets up the kill to order type situation. Because now what they do, and this is what the researchers figured out very early on, I think within that happened towards the end of 2006, that they're actually blood typing, tissue typing, and organ scanning a whole lot of these prisoners of conscience.
Hmm.
Okay. And that way, when someone, finds that ad, pays that $100,000 to $200,000 for the heart that they're going to get as a transplant tourist, there's already an incarcerated prisoner of conscience who's been pre-matched to them with blood and tissue in this giant database, and then they can be shipped and killed to order. So that's
Huh.
how you get the
Huh.
2 weeks. Yeah.
So there are ads like this man who came from Israel saw an ad somewhere that's
No, in his case, I don't know the details of how the system actually identified it, but they had actually been going to China for kidneys before. This is something that Jakob Levy told me, but they hadn't like for him, since he was a heart transplant surgeon, it didn't occur to him that these could be people being actually killed for those, right? For
huh,
those
huh.
organs. But so it happened in many ways. In some cases, it would be state subsidized healthcare that would go to China because they didn't have the organs themselves. In other cases, in 2006, there were actual ads that had advertised 2 week wait times and even
And where are
prices
the
for
ads? But
organs.
where are the
They
ads?
were online, and the moment that we started, we have them archived. I could send you a few,
Yeah.
but they're basically most of them disappeared soon after we started reporting on this in 2006, and
Huh.
it became more of an underground thing. Basically, every time there's been kind of waves of reporting on this issue over the last 20 years, and every time we do it, they take more of the information offline, and once they figure out that what we're actually queuing into to get evidence, they take that offline somehow and make it much harder to find. But there's
So
ways to
when
do
it
it.
was online, so it was for anybody all over the world, anyone, if they had the money.
They were in Chinese language typically, so you would have to be able
Oh.
to read Chinese. But
Huh.
yes, for anyone in the world. I mean, people from all over the world have gone, from the U.S., from Germany, from South Korea. A lot. There was actually a film crew that took undercover cameras, like on the lapel and so forth,
Huh.
into China asking for organs. They found crazy things. Taiwan was a big transplant tourism, and of course, the super elites in China, they have unlimited access to this system. Yeah.
Huh. So, um, so continuing your chronology, your journey into all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I mean, it's just that at the beginning you sort of you fell into some of this awareness of some of these cases or some of these things that were going on, and then you decided to study it further.
Well, exactly, because I mean, this is going to sound weird. So this is why I was joking with you beforehand, right? That you're a psychiatrist and you'll help me figure out why I'm interested in crimes against humanity, because I am. I have been for a while. I married a woman whose father was a Holocaust survivor. He just
Oh,
passed a couple
yeah.
of years ago. We
Huh.
actually made an amazing documentary about him. It's one of the few optimistic Holocaust documentaries out there, I
Huh.
think. And I've been to Auschwitz actually seven times for a variety of different reasons, including, with the director of the museum and just like casually with students on my own. I've been fascinated with why, how does this happen, right? Because
I see.
most
I
human
see. So
beings,
crimes against humanity starting, of course, the biggest one was Auschwitz. And that I could see now how that kind of led into this is a kind I was actually when I was writing the description for the show, I was thinking about this, that it's a kind of Holocaust, this organ transplant killing.
I mean, you could call it that. I tend not to specifically call it like certain particular atrocities because some people take issue with that. But
Uh,
it's a very extreme atrocity. I would argue, I could convince you it's actually genocidal, but that word is used so casually these days to describe all sorts of other types of
yeah,
horrible killing that aren't genocide. I
yeah.
don't tend to use that either. I just say it's like an atrocity, a crime against humanity. It's one of the worst things human beings can do to each other. Yeah,
Now, I want you to, could you mention also there's the second population in China that they
that's right.
like to kill.
Well,
Um,
I know, and this is one of the huge tragedies of this, right? Because so they built it on the backs of the Falun Gong starting in 2000, and by 2005, there's this peak of growth of these hospitals. And towards the end of the 2000s, we get to something like 142 hospitals that are, have these transplant units that are churning out transplants regularly. I mean, at scale. And that's when we get the number. The Ethan Gutman goes to Congress and testifies. His number estimate is 60 to 100,000 transplants per year based on the data that was available. That's, by the way, a very conservative estimate. But the bounds, the 100,000 is conservative. The 60,000 is sort of the minimum based on some very basic calculations that you would make. But we don't know the exact numbers because, again, like, this is a state secret, so we have to figure it out through a whole bunch of different lines of evidence, right? And around that same time, when Ethan Gutman went to Congress to talk, he's one of the heroes, by the way, of researching this issue. Right now, he's written a second book. The first book was called The Slaughter. This book is called The Xinjiang Procedure. At the time, he was noting that they are starting to apparently use Uyghur Muslims from the northwest of China
that's what
for
I was
these
alluding
organ
to.
transplants as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah. And we weren't sure exactly what was happening then. We just knew that it was also a very vulnerable population that was in essentially a police controlled state. So it made it extra vulnerable. We even have reports now that people in their homes have been blood typed and tissue typed, not just incarcerated. But what they did was they dehumanized them further. They incarcerated 1 million plus of them. And then, yeah, as I said, they're even doing that kind of invasive expensive medical testing in people's homes up in Xinjiang. And this is the tragedy of it, is that basically, no one did anything about it for 14 or 15 years. It's like Niemöller's poem, right? First they came for the disabled people. I don't remember how it goes, but that was one of the
Yes,
first
yes.
groups in Germany, was the disabled people, and no one said anything. Then it came for the next group, and they came for the next group. And that's kind of that's the process. And I'm actually, right now, I'm seeing increased dehumanizing rhetoric against Christians. With, we have these notable cases of the Zion Church that has been, basically, most of the pastors have been arrested.
Where is that?
So that's in China.
Oh, in China,
And
there's that.
and yeah, there's a one of the most popular Christian churches. It's crime, actually. It's very interesting because the Zion Church was very trying very hard to be as apolitical as possible. Like, I think they went to great lengths to do it. But during COVID, what they couldn't do. Everyone was locked down in a very extreme way, right? So they figured out to do their masses or ceremonies, services online, and this became incredibly popular. So their crime wasn't, they were trying to be incredibly apolitical, but their crime was becoming too popular. And
Huh.
that's when all the pastors got arrested. And right now, I think 18 of them remain in prison. And actually, Catholic clergy, even though there's this Vatican deal which they created, I mentioned earlier, they're actually being put under control. But anecdotally, I noticed this dehumanizing rhetoric, and I've talked to some pretty prominent China Christian human rights sort of advocates, And one of them told me, absolutely, I'm seeing the same thing. And it's not just anecdotal, we're seeing it systemically. So I'm worried that the Chinese Communist Party is hunting, is
Uh-huh.
looking for other groups, or even starting to set up another group to be part of this horrible kill to order industry.
Yeah, so just like Falun Gong, this it's threatening because there are so many people who believe in it, and that could overthrow the communists theoretically.
Well, to see, to the communists, it's really fascinating. They really, this is what made the difference between a totalitarian society and just a mere authoritarian, like just a really bad dictatorship. Okay, is bad dictatorships can evolve. Like this is what happened actually in Taiwan and in South Korea, right? And the way that they evolve is through civil society. You know, Democracy in America, right? The famous book, de Tocqueville's famous book, where he celebrates the thing he says will make America amazingly successful is this ability of Americans to kind of get together, self-organize, and fix problems that are needed, right? That's basically civil society. And the difference between a totalitarian regime and an authoritarian one is that communist China destroys all semblance of civil society because they know that in civil society are the
I
seeds of
see.
change, and they
Yes.
are uninterested in change. They're interested in supremacy.
Fascinating. So now, do all the people, I mean, does it just depend? Oh, I see that we need to take a break. But when we come back, um, I'm gonna ask you, or you'll have a chance to answer, um, whether whether it depends upon what they are what organ they are transplanting, as to whether the person dies or not. Or well, let me just ask you, or do they kill them all because they don't want them going out and telling the world what they did, how they were, taken, kidnapped, and then operated on. Like, for example, you were talking about the cornea um, cases.
Yeah,
The person wouldn't have to die if they lost their cornea.
correct.
So what happens to those people?
Well, to make a long story short, we
Yeah.
believe, or do you want to do this after the break?
Well, you can do a long story after the break. Let's do that. Let's leave people on a cliffhanger. Okay. We will be right back. My guest is Jan Jekielek, and his book is called Kill to Order: China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. So stay tuned. You will want to hear the answer. And welcome back to Dr. Carol's Couch. I'm your psychiatrist host, Dr. Carole Lieberman. We're having an amazingly interesting episode today with my guest, Jan Jekielek, and his book, Kill to Order. We're talking about this plague, in a sense, that the Chinese Communist Party has created, an industry that they have created. I mean, it's amazing the number of hospitals Jan was just talking about. And before the break, I had asked him, do all the people who have their organs stolen, essentially, die? Are they killed? Or does it depend upon the organ? Like you can't live without your part, but you could live without your cornea. So, Jan?
Well, so the answer is a little bit complicated. First of all, these people have been dehumanized in great ways, so it's very easy to kill them. And indeed, there was a rule around Falun Gong practitioners because they were so hard to break, re-educate, or transform, that all Falun Gong deaths in these prisons will be considered suicides. So this
Huh.
was a setup. This was allowed basically the guards and the prison masters to torture them as hard as they could, really, and made them this kind of disposable group. Now, but at the same time, of course, each organ is worth quite a bit of money. So that might stop people from being, sort of killed right away if multiple organs can be extracted. In fact, we saw with the advent of ECMO, for example, ECMO is a technology you'll be familiar with, but the viewers might not. It's basically something that circumvents the lungs and heart. Typically, it's used for operations where a lot of damage has been done in the body and you need to basically shut those parts off for a bit, fix them up, and then plug things back in, right? So there was a huge surge in Chinese hospitals buying portable ECMO machines. And it's
Huh.
exactly these transplant hospitals. So we believe the reason for that is because they wanted, you can actually, so a little bit more background, you can't transplant from a completely dead body. There has to be circulation in the body. So we believe those machines are being used to keep bodies basically
Hmm.
alive longer so that more organs can be used for these procedures. But ultimately, no one survives. There's only one exception that we've ever come across. And I never believed that we would ever find a survivor of this. And it's just an unusual, uncanny situation that he did.
Well, how did he survive?
Well, so this was
He
early.
pretended to be dead? Yeah.
Well, a little bit.
Yeah.
So in the early 2000s, this is when this happened. So he was one of these people who was captured, incarcerated purely for his beliefs. And he basically, at one point, was operated on and woke up kind of shackled he got incarcerated. He spent years in prison. He wasn't, basically going to give up his faith. And
Uh-huh.
one day he was operated on and he woke up shackled to a bedpost and had a giant gash, 14-inch gash in his side, and felt horrible inside. And he didn't know what had happened. He didn't know he had been organ harvested. He just knows some operation had been done. And later, so many years later, he was rescued and basically he had escaped to Thailand. And in Thailand, he kind of knew more, like he suspected that he had been organ harvested, and an assistant secretary of state back in the Trump 45 administration, a man named Robert Destro, rescued him to America. And then they did very detailed body scans and they found that he was missing part of his liver and part of his lung. Now, it's
Huh.
possible to do partial liver transplants. The lung is a mystery. It's unclear why they took it. Maybe they made a mistake, or they were just harvesting some lung tissue for some reason. But we think it was probably an experiment. It was probably an opportunity for these, let's say, very ethically challenged surgeons to test out doing one of these partial liver transplants, which were just coming online at the time. That's the guess. We don't know for sure because the Chinese Communist Party won't tell us. Ultimately, the onus is on them to explain why they did it, right? And they don't. What they do is they typically attack the messenger. In this case, the amazing thing is they actually did issue a response, and they said that they were trying to change it to save his life by doing this. And there's no scenario basically that would justify the intervention that was done,
Yes.
right? It's kind of just like a cheap excuse. But the reality is they actually admitted to operating on him against his will, and that's
Uh-huh.
extremely rare to get anything like that because typically all they do is just say you guys are evil. It's all propaganda. You're just trying to hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. That's one of my favorite responses because
Uh-huh.
they act as if they actually represent the Chinese people, which
Uh-huh.
they really don't. It's a whole rigmarole. But yeah, so he's around. He's hiding out because there's an interest in either repatriating him or stopping him from his
Uh,
testimonies. But he's alive and he lived to tell the tale.
wow. So, um, is there what do you call it? Uh Trying to think of the right word, but is there sort of a is part of the reason why it's hard to get them to stop, besides the fact that this is a big money maker, right? I mean, I would imagine uh, that's one of the reasons they wouldn't want to stop, besides also wanting to kill the people, the Falun Gang and the Uyghurs. Um, but but is there some kind of um, is part of the problem that places now? I know you say that in America we're kind of uh, helping them to continue this. We're and is there sort of a general sense from people outside China who think they might need an organ someday to maybe not want to stop this industry?
Well, there's a few things happening, okay? One is that you remember there was this hot mic moment back in maybe September. basically what happened was, this was astonishing. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un are walking in Tiananmen Square, and they're observing a military parade, and the Chinese state central television catches them on a hot mic, okay? And the conversation, I'll paraphrase it very briefly. Putin is responding to Xi. So Xi says, when we're 70, we're just babies. Okay. Putin responds, through continual organ transplantation, perhaps we can achieve immortality. Right. And Xi responds, our target is 150 years. Now, this is something that was a huge revelation for me
Yes, I
because we,
remember this now. Yeah, I have.
yeah, no, that's right. Right. So but if you're actually sort of immersed in the China stuff, right, the China issues, Project 981 is this elite longevity project, which has the target of 150
Oh,
years.
well.
And I knew that existed for a long time. And I also knew the forced organ harvesting was existed, but I hadn't realized until they kind of explained it to me on a hot mic that the organ harvesting was a central part of the elite longevity project. So basically, if you're, in addition to this huge money making, right? Obviously, it's like we estimate it's about a $9 billion annual industry.
Mhm.
Um, if you're Chinese super elite, you have unlimited on-demand organs available to you in perpetuity. So that makes it harder to stop, obviously, because especially if they're using that, which they obviously are, to extend their lives. There's even kind of weird anecdotes about it. There was like someone sent me years ago an obituary, and this sounds very creepy and weird, but you just get stuff like this periodically. But there was a guy who wrote the obituary extolling how amazing it was that the state level minister had gotten so many organs transplanted in his body. It was like kind of he was telling about how great that was, right?
Uh-huh.
But anyway, that's one piece. Okay. The second piece is that they kind of, I have a whole chapter in the book actually in Kill to Order that talks about how the Chinese Communist Party makes us complicit. They use whatever they can, aspects of our free society, money, but also our desperation, right? And I've opened the book with a woman who's a composite character. She's looking for, she's desperate. She needs a kidney. She's been on dialysis for a few years. The longer you stay on dialysis, your prognosis goes down quite rapidly,
Right.
right? As you're staying on dialysis. And so she hears about the China option, and she imagines she can be there for her kids some more years, all this. She doesn't really think about where it might come from. And she goes and gets it done. So there's that kind of thing. And sometimes people, they don't think about the ramifications. They don't think about the source very much. They're just
Uh-huh.
panicking, and they want to be there. And it could even be extremely altruistic. They want to be there for their family, right? Like in the case of May, who I opened the book with. But there's also this other aspect, which is absolutely, as you point out, right? I mean, for people that do have loose morals, who might look down on people who are foreign, might have different skin color, whatever, those kinds of people, like, of course, they're going to be interested in, an organ if they have the money for it, because, it's life. If you had to wait a year or two in an ethical situation, you can get it in 2 weeks just for some money. Why not do that, right? So there's these kind of loose morals people around the world. Absolutely, they exist. And I have some examples that I cite of that, where we actually know of some people that have done things like this, and some quite extreme examples of that. And
You
then,
know,
of course, yeah, go ahead.
no, no, go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. And I was just saying, and of course, also we just have people who are kind of, that's a small group that are kind of psychopathic, and um, they exist among us as well. And I think some of these people are involved, obviously, in this industry, but
Well, yeah. Yes, maybe I want to ask you about that, but enabling was the word I was trying to think of. Like people who enable alcoholics, because
Oh yeah. Oh, no, no,
so
enabling. So
enabling.
so we actually train some of these surgeons. Like, this is the part that's really tragic, because by turning a blind eye, like, listen, all you need to know, right, really, to start things off, is that you can get an organ in 2 weeks, that it's actually a regular thing, and that it's scheduled. And that's not an ethical system. You don't need a giant reports like the China Tribunal, of 1,000 page. I don't forget how long it is, but like, there's voluminous evidence, but you don't need all the voluminous evidence to know there's a grossly unethical thing happening when you have 2 weeks and and a scheduled heart transplant. So we have no business Chinese transplant surgeons or funding Chinese transplant leadership research, pardon me, or having partnerships, transplant partnerships with hospitals or research institutions, or doing research together. I mean, you know, you want to talk about enabling, it's hugely enabling because it basically casts a veneer of credibility on a system which doesn't deserve any, like, the opposite. It deserves ultimate condemnation to
Right.
get it to stop, right? So yes, there's a lot of enabling inadvertently. I don't think people are thinking to themselves. I hope they're not thinking to themselves, I'm going to help them get away with it. No, they're probably being told, you know, oh, like we're the reformers, right? This is a standard line from the Communist Party, right? And how they kind of bamboozle, they call it wooing the barbarians, right? Sort of convincing the Westerners to help them. And they'll say, well, we're the reformers. You know, we want to make change. Yeah, we have this kind of shady transplant situation, but there's these hardliners. The hardliners want to push this hard, but if you work with us, but don't raise a fuss, because if you raise a fuss, then the hardliners win. Let's just work together and we'll
Huh.
change this. And then you just do that for 20 years and nothing changes. And now you've made the people involved that have been agreeing with you, believing your lies, right, quite complicit, and they're of course very afraid to admit to the fact that they've been bamboozled, you know, or don't want to admit it to themselves and still keep thinking one day maybe they'll change, right? As opposed to
Uh-huh.
putting your foot down and saying, stop this, this is monstrous, this is horrible.
Uh-huh.
Where's the humanity for among you people, you know, like that would be kind of the normal thing to say in this situation.
Yes. So I can see Putin, we're talking about like now with the war in Iran and all that, and wondering like who's gonna come to Iran's aid, and so China, Russia, we think of all the different our enemies, North Korea. Um, but so I could see where, I mean, there have been all these rumors about Putin, various medical problems that was alleged to have had. So I could see, getting back to the hot mic, I could see him, wanting to stay allies with China more than America for the reason of, I mean, there are lots of things that go into it. It's not just about the body parts, but certainly if he's thinking that maybe he does have, or he's getting older, maybe he will have some organs that fail, I would think he would want to be BFFs with China to make sure he could get the organs easily, as compared to America.
So, you know, something really interesting is I actually think that this was an actual hot mic moment, but many Chinese I've spoken with who, you know, kind of very aware of how incredibly hierarchical and controlling the Chinese Communist Party is, they don't really believe that a hot mic moment was possible. They think it was a setup. They think that this was kind of
Huh.
advertising, basically
Huh.
saying to the world in a kind of casual, viral way, hey, if you have pretty loose morals and you don't care about things like basic human life, you can join our club. Of course, that the cost of it is supporting us, or something like that. I don't know if that's true. I tend to think it was an actual hot mic, but many Chinese disagree with me. To your
Uh-huh.
point,
So, getting back to what you were saying about how we train Chinese doctors um, to do these operations. So do you mean like Chinese doctors, Chinese people who have been graduated from medical school, come to the United States for internships and residencies in surgery, let's say, and they get, well, I don't know if it's like I mean, I guess it's a pretty specific kind of procedure, but I mean, is that where these people are being trained, or is there some
yeah.
more specific kind of thing? Like, hey, if anybody in China who wants to learn how to do this, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, I know when I was going through internship and residency and so on, there were people, besides Americans, there were people from various countries who were also interns and residents and so on, moving up the chain. So is that what you're talking about? Or are there people who come here specifically, Chinese people, who come here specifically to go into specific programs in America to learn how to do that?
Um, it's kind of, I would guess all of the above is the answer, because we
Uh-huh.
have examples where Chinese surgeons come and do some kind of training program here. There's literal examples of that. There, I think the Select Committee on I believe it was the Select Committee on China and Congress on the CCP that pointed that out at one point.
Uh-huh.
There's there's people being trained here and going back to China as transplant surgeons. There's I mean, kind of the gamut. Like if you're in that anywhere in that space, because it's not just the surgeons too, right? It's anyone that you need whole transplant teams to
Mm-hmm.
actually do this. You need an explant team, you need an implant team, you need support staff, nurses, all of this. So it's kind of all of the above, right? In general, I think the policy answer to this is just simply saying that the US does not cooperate in anything related to transplantation. Now, when I say the US, for example, that the way that could work is, anyone that's receiving NIH money, which is a lot of people, right? That's the biggest grantor of scientific research in the world. Anyone that's getting bioscientific research in the world, anyone that's getting that kind of funding is not going to get that funding if they have anything to do with transplant
Uh-huh.
research in China, for example,
Uh-huh.
or because really that's what it is, right? It's we don't really have evidence of any sort of an, there might be some, but I doubt it, of an ethical system, and they've certainly never provided any evidence of an ethical transplant system. And it's even hard to believe how there would be one, given how big this kill to order industry is, and how what happens when a huge bureaucracy around something like this gets created is very hard to dismantle, especially since so much money is flowing through it.
Well, this is a really fascinating conundrum. um, because because most people um don't want to die, you know? And a lot of people have a fear of death. Not they don't just not want to die, but they think about it a lot or um and and of course, and we're crazed with doing all these things, especially these days. There are all these supplements and different, body cryotherapy or, all different uh, crazy kinds of things to do to supposedly prolong your life. So it's hard for me to imagine not wanting to do something if you have an organ that's killing you, um to not want to go to where you could get a fresh one, a new one. I mean, it's almost asking people to go against their own biology, psychology, like it's kind of holding out. I mean, I'm not saying it's certainly unethical. It's terrible. I don't mean to give like the impression, but if
Yeah.
I was sitting here with some kind of organ problem, um, uh, and now that you've told me about this, and I have a lot that I want to more that I want to do in life, and I have a daughter, and I have, like there are a lot of people depending upon me, so. So I would be hard pressed to not take advantage of something like that. Of course, I would say it was terribly, I mean, like basically I'd be killing people, whoever the person or people were whose organs I was borrowing. I'd be killing them, and that's terrible. And it would be very hard to sort of, it'd be very hard to be at peace with that. Um, but it's also very hard to sort of go against a natural feeling of not wanting to die.
I
What?
mean, I think you're right. I think they take advantage of people's desperation. This is one way in which, one of the punchlines in the book, in a way, is that how the Chinese Communist Party instrumentalizes everything, right? Our goodwill, our fear, information itself, possible allies. You look at what's happening to Iran, human bodies. This is what this organ industry is about. I mean, and in this case, our fear and our desperation, and even in some cases our, desire to be there for our loved ones. I mean, I hope that most people would choose not to kill someone for their organs. I mean, I think, you can sort of imagine there's even kind of legal arguments which have been laid out showing that this is a kind of a murder, actually. Like, I think, if you had
Yes.
you could enact laws that
Yes.
specify that for people in case they're confused about
Right.
whether this is murder or not. I mean, I think that would be very useful. I would start, though, by reducing the incentive structures and just ending our complicity in it, establishing in law that this is real and is happening, as some of the legislation that's now passed the House and in front of the Senate will
Ah,
do, and cutting off government flows of money and insurance money to China. All of this would have a profound effect in reducing the number of people going for transplants. Um, and then, educating people about how it's murder. I mean, of course, that would be very valuable too. I think, I had a devastating conversation with Mike. I'll mention it's Mike Rowe, prominent podcaster, where he says, if it was my daughter, kind of like what you're saying, I might think about it, right? And I say, well, you might think about it, but I know you well enough now that I don't think you'd do it. And I think that's why we have a moral conscience. That's why, this is part of what being human is about, is figuring out what our morality is, figuring out how to be good and not murdering people for our own organs. And so, yeah, like our minds might go there, right? And hopefully the decision, I believe we'll have to meet our maker. That you don't want to have that on your when you're being judged. But
ah.
also, for you, what is that the legacy you want to set for your children or for posterity in general? Even if you don't have children, do you want that to be your legacy? I would hope not.
Yeah, I'm just thinking one thing we need to say is that there are every day in America, there are organ transplants of various types, heart, lung, liver, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and it's not the same. It's not, well, it's not illegal and it's not immoral because the people, well, it's either from a cadaver or a living donor. So I just want to put that in there that not
Yeah.
all organ transplants are bad.
Of course, of course. And this is actually and part of the problem in having this engagement with a monstrous system like this, right? Is like in the last year in 2025, two US transplant procurement systems were shut down by the HHS. And the reason they were is because they were systemically violating the dead donor rule. And what that means is, like, there's, again, as I mentioned early on, in the show, there has to be this catastrophic accident, and the ethics team has to decide there's a very low probability this person's coming back, because you can't actually transplant from a completely dead body.
Mm.
Okay, there has to be some circulation still. So, someone has to make that call, and these two transplant systems were getting way too loose in those calls, right? And this is like, for
Uh-huh.
example, in China, when you look at the Chinese transplant literature, two of very, very good researchers looked at this, and they looked at the Chinese transplant literature and asked the question, could it be that, because it's so common there, we know that they've actually written killing people into their scientific methods without
Mm.
realizing it.
Mm.
And they found 70 instances out of only like 2 to 3,000 papers where basically they had written into their scientific methods that the person died by having their organs removed. So they literally were
Uh-huh.
killed for the organs. And that it's so normalized there that they write it into their scientific methods, and that is sort of bleeding into us. We're not changing them, as the mantra was for years. They're
Uh,
changing us, and not in very good ways. And we have to be very careful. And there's even op-eds in the New York Times arguing for reducing the stringency of the dead donor rule, which again is the same thing. It's becoming more loose about how quickly you can take the organs from someone when they have a
well,
higher probability of coming back. Yeah.
well, yes. I mean, that's why I was saying in my introduction about you think that this is just in China. Um, I mean, with this whole craze, there seems to be with this whole longevity craze and the whole, this whole thing about dr being transfused with blood of younger people,
Yeah.
like Dracula kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it could very easily go out of control. And so, so
100%.
so this really isn't that improbable. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. This has been fascinating. I really admire you for writing this in the first place and bringing this to our attention. So let me give out the name of the book again. It's called Killed to Order: China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. And again, the my guest has been Jan Jekielek. I'm getting better with each time pronouncing it. Um, and thank you so much. Yes, this is a very slippery slope. And thank you for bringing this to our attention.
Thank you. And for those that might be interested in getting the book, the direct line to that on Amazon is
Ah,
killtoorder.com, killtoorder.com. I think this is an issue where awareness actually helps us change it. And the book is available. You could get it for your library or for your local bookstore or on Amazon at killtoorder.com. And thank you for a very thoughtful interview. I've really enjoyed this.
you're very, very welcome. And thank you all for listening. You've been listening to Dr.